Hi, and welcome to Christopher's Cucina. I am Chef Christopher Corvell, a native New Yorker who grew up with Italian food and over the years have been honing my craft to really perfect what I believe is great Italian food. In this episode, I'll be making my world famous meatballs with soft pecorino polenta and tomato sauce. Let me get started on the pomodoro sauce. There's a few steps to this process, although it's quite simple. I'll be walking you through the technique of making the sauce as well as some technique on cutting vegetables and so on and so forth. So let me get started by browning the sausage, okay? There's some sweet Italian sausage here. I have a little bit of olive oil going into a pot. And what we want to do is we want to brown the sausage. What that does is that imparts a little bit of flavor. We want to get a little bit of color on the outside of the sausage. So I'm simply placing the sausage links inside of a hot pan with a little bit of olive oil. The pan's on medium heat. We can turn it up slightly. And what we're looking to do is we're looking to achieve some brown color here. And what that does is that's going to impart flavor in the pomodoro sauce. As that's browning, I'm going to get some onions cut in the meantime. Being mindful of your fingertips, you want to keep your fingers back and you want to slice directly through the onion. The onion's cut in half with the root end intact on the back. What that does is it keeps the onion still whole while you're slicing through. Going to cut through the center and then down to dice. The size doesn't particularly matter here. You want it to be even, but it doesn't have to be, you don't have to worry about the size. This part is going to get blended. This would be considered a medium dice, as well as we have some garlic that's already been chopped. This is a whole head of garlic that has been chopped. The whole idea of this sauce is it's very few ingredients. There's whole plum tomatoes that have been crushed. There's two parts of it. One part's gonna go into the pot with the onions and the garlic, and that's going to infuse some flavor. The sausage, once it's browned, will come out onto a plate. We'll let that stay and continue with the sauce. Onions, garlic, and the other half of the tomatoes. And now, as the sausage is continuing to brown, we're gonna flip them. We don't wanna get them too dark in this case, but we're gonna flip the sausage and get some good color on the second side of the casing. So now as this is happening, this will take another minute or so, and then we'll remove the sausage from the pan. Then we'll hold it on a plate, and then we'll add it back momentarily. This step here can be omitted, and then you can simply start by cooking the onions and the garlic if you wanted to keep this a vegetarian sauce. Now that the sausage has good color on it, we're going to remove it from the pan, still keeping the heat on medium. Any residual fat that comes out of the sausage can stay right in the pan. In the event it gets too dark, you would want to clean that out. So then we're going to come through and add our onion. We're not looking to get any color on the onion. We just want to sweat what we call sweat, which means that we want to cook the onions until they're translucent, but without any color. I have a wooden spoon here. I tend to like the idea of a wooden spoon. It feels a little homier. It feels like something that belongs in a pot rather than a metal spoon. So the onions are in. We're going to add our garlic. This is just chopped garlic. About 3 large cloves. Again, over medium heat. What we want to do is, and we're going to add a little bit of salt at this point. What the salt does is it'll help remove moisture from there. And we want to pull the moisture out of the onions and the garlic. All right. So this is going to cook for 2 to 3 minutes on medium heat. Italian food is good for, it's soul cooking. It's food that comes from the soul. Deep-rooted recipes that are true and tried. And so as this continues to cook, the next step after this would be to add the crushed tomatoes to the pan. And it's only going to be half of it. The reason why we only want to add half at this point is because the other half, we don't want to blend the other half. This part with the onions and the garlic is going to get blended. So the idea here is to add this sauce, cook it for a few minutes with a little bit of water. And what the water does is it helps facilitate the cooking process. We don't necessarily want to take plum tomatoes that are canned tomatoes. There's nothing wrong with canned tomatoes. They tend to be concentrated, so we don't want to overcook down canned tomato without adding something to help balance that. Otherwise, it tends to get a little bit thick and almost a little bit bitter. The water helps the cooking process. So as the onions continue to cook down with the garlic, we have a little bit of salt in here so far. Now we're going to go through and add some of the half of the plum tomatoes and some water. This is where the water comes in. Again, what happens here is that you add a little bit of water to this so we're not completely concentrating down the canned tomatoes. It gives it a little bit of, it softens it so it's not so thick. What we don't want to do is over reduce, okay? Now that we have the onions, the garlic cooked, the tomato in, and the water, we simply want to bring this up to a boil. Then what will happen is we're going to just simply blend this with a hand blender. Once we blend the sauce, at that point we'll slide the sausage back in. The sausage is not cooked at this point, nor does it need to be. The sausage will actually cook into the sauce as it cooks and impart the flavor in the sauce. Then we'll remove it after the sauce is finished, and you can do multiple things with it, but we're done with it theoretically when the sauce is cooked. We do want to add a little bit of salt at this point as well. So the idea of seasoning is you want to season in layers. Generally what happens is, what we want to avoid is seasoning at the very end. The salt will actually be front forward on your tongue, and we want to keep it a balanced seasoning. So we season in layers. The onions, the garlic have already been seasoned. The tomatoes, we've introduced the tomatoes and we added another level of seasoning there. You can use black pepper in this. I don't feel the need, but it's certainly optional at that point. You could add some red chili flakes in this if you want to amp up the heat a little bit, but I'm going to show you what I find to be a basic good pomodoro sauce. So as this comes up to a boil, which won't take long, we can blend it at that point. And the wooden spoon it just feels like a better tool in your hand in this case. There's something satisfying about using a wooden tool rather than metal on metal. You certainly can. If all you have is metal, it'll certainly work. We do like the idea of using a wooden spoon in this case. Many variations on this sauce. It all depends on kind of what you knew, what you grew up with. There's no right and wrong to this. It's a matter of interpretation. This is something that I like, that works well for me. So as this comes to a boil, we are going to take our immersion blender. This is a handheld blender. This is called an immersion blender. You could take and put this in a regular blender or a food processor if that's all you have. The one thing you do want to be cautious of is that if you don't have a deep enough pan here, this will splatter, or this can. What we want to do, we're going to take, and using a towel in case the handle is hot, we're going to take and tilt the pan and blend the sauce in the corner. What that does is it gives us enough surface area to blend the sauce well without it splattering all over the place. You don't have to fully puree this at this point if you don't want to. It's simply optional. Pureeing the garlic and the onions all the way down provides a smoother sauce, but it's not critical. And that's all there is to that. So now that our sauce is blended, now we can take and add our brown sausage right back to the pan. Any juice that accumulates on the pan, you want to get right back in. That's all flavor that's going to be added back into the sauce. One of the great things about tomato sauce too is it can be used for so many different variations on different things. It can be used for pizzas. It can be used for various different types of pasta. It's a classic sauce, considered a mother sauce in the French cuisine, which means that mother sauces are the sauces that were developed early on, and there's 5 major mother sauces, and this is one of them. And what it is it's a basic sauce that you can make derivatives of other sauces from. So that's why this sauce can be used in many different ways. At this point, now that the sauce has been blended and the sausage has been added back to it, now we can take the rest of our whole plum tomatoes that we've crushed. These are just crushed by hand, and they're simply going to go back into this pot. And what's going to happen now is you're going to have the 2 different textures of the pureed sauce with the sausage, the whole pieces of sausage in here, as well as the chunky version of this tomato of the canned tomatoes here. So what that'll do is, it'll give you some different texture in the sauce rather than just one smooth component. It's also important to pour away from yourself. What you don't want to do is pour, particularly when something's hot, pour something this way. What'll generally happen is it'll hit the pan and it'll splash forward. if this was hot, it could pose a bit of a danger or an accident. So what you simply want to do is let the product fall away from you. So now once these tomatoes are incorporated, now the sauce simply just needs to simmer for a little bit. We don't necessarily want to season at this point, although we can. What we do want to do, and this is very important to do, is to taste your food along the way. What that's going to do is it's going to tell you right exactly where you're at now. If we found that this sauce was overly seasoned right now, it could be problematic because once something's, it still needs to cook down. If something's over seasoned at this point, generally as something cooks down, it's going to make that even stronger, and it could add up to being something that's overly seasoned, which you may not want. So it's important to, as we talked about earlier, to season in stages and in layers, except you want to do it incrementally, little by little, because that way at the end, in case you find that you need a little bit more salt or some more seasoning, at that point you can go through and really kind of get it where you need to be, but it won't be the first time that the seasoning has hit the pan. So now this is over a medium-low heat. We don't want to cook this down rapidly. There's a chance that this could scorch. You want to stir this incrementally from the middle, working your way out. In case something decides it wants to stick to the bottom, if your pan was too hot, the sauce is going to want to scorch or burn if you're not careful. So you simply want to just let this cook and develop some flavor at this point. The stove will do the work at this point. Now that all of your components are in there. As this begins to cook in about 45 minutes to an hour, we'll relook at this and we'll check the consistency of it, we'll check the seasoning of it, and we'll finish it as the sauce is coming to an end with some few whole basil leaves. That'll impart a nice floral note into the sauce as the sauce finishes up. You don't want to cook this into the sauce too much. You can. It tends to get a little bit bitter. So the idea here is to add this towards the end and impart flavor into the sauce by letting it just kind of accept the flavor of the basil and not cook it in. So this is going to continue to cook and simmer on a medium-low heat for 45 to 50 minutes. So after about 45 minutes to an hour, this will continue to simmer. And when we come back from the break, we will roll into the next part of the dish, which will be the meatballs, and we will get into some technique and some processing on the meatballs. As the sauce continues to simmer, we're stirring it ever so often just to ensure that it's not sticking to the bottom of the pan and the sauce is continuing to develop its flavor. At that point, we roll right into the meatballs. Meatballs, something I generally love. Many variations on meatballs. This is one that I personally love, and it just tends to work well for me. Interesting things about meatballs, there's many variations on it, as I stated. In this case, I like to use ground beef and ground pork only. Some people like to use ground veal. It's optional. I don't find that it adds anything personally. I like the idea of the pork. You get some fat and some flavor from the pork as well as from the ground beef. This is going to go into a larger bowl. And what I like to do here is gently break apart the ground beef at this point. We don't want to put it in one big lump at this point because it naturally will want to overmix at that point. By separating the ground beef as well as the pork, what we're doing is we're integrating this without mixing it at this point. We're allowing everything to mix through properly without overmixing. So by separating everything and adding it incrementally certainly helps with that process. As we're integrating the pork and the beef together here incrementally, separately, at this point it's important to wash your hands. Washing your hands is instrumental in food handling in general, in particular when you're using raw meat. So soap and water. And we come back to adding the additions to the meatballs. We want to come back to the tomato sauce, and again, going back to keeping an eye on your sauce. You want to stir this periodically, making sure that everything's coming together well as it would be a good opportunity to retaste this and see where we're at. just where we want it. The salt level's correct at this point. We'll likely need to go back and add some more salt after this, but as this continues to cook, we'll be mindful of the salt as it progresses. On to the meatballs. Several ingredients you can add to this. Again, this works for me. This is what I like. Some chopped oregano, fresh oregano. Fresh herbs are much better in this case than dried herbs. You can use dried herbs if that's all you have. You would want to use less quantity of dry herbs than you would fresh, as they tend to be a little bit stronger. Some chopped rosemary. Again, add a deep earthy flavor. Parsley, flat leaf chopped Italian parsley. If you have curly parsley and that's all you have, no problem. We have some fresh ground Parmesan cheese. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we're adding moisture to these meatballs, okay? Oftentimes people will use dried breadcrumbs. I personally don't like the idea of dried breadcrumbs. What it does is it pulls moisture out. Unless you soak them in milk, that would be the way to go. What I like to do is take some fresh bread, tear it up, soak it in milk or water, squeeze it out well, and that'll be your breadcrumb component to this. So we're going to add some squeezed Italian bread to this. Fresh ricotta cheese. This adds some additional moisture as well. So what I'm doing is we're trying to add things in different increments within the same bowl here. So again, what that does is it gives everything a chance to commingle and mix without over mixing. Some fresh mozzarella, cubed up. Again, this will add some moisture as well. That's what we're going for here. Eggs. Eggs are a binder in this case. I'm going to take 3 whole eggs, integrate those in. What we have here, this is some cooked celery and some cooked garlic and a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of butter with some salt. We want to cook this ahead of time so it softens. We want to cool it down. The idea of cooling it down is you're not adding something that's overly hot into something that's exceptionally cold. When you mix things together, you want to have all of your ingredients in similar temperatures. It'll allow for everything to mix and incorporate better. What you want to do is add all of this as well as any juice that collects. And then a couple more ingredients for the meatballs. I'm going to go through and stir the sauce. Again, it's cooking down just fine. We cooked the garlic, we cooked the celery. Okay, those come in, those will be a little bit softer. I like the idea of an onion that is not cooked in the meatballs. We're looking for some texture here. So the onion, by keeping this raw and dicing the onion, adding it to the meatballs, what that does is as those meatballs bake, the onions will inherently soften, but they won't get as soft as, say, the onions and the celery and the garlic that's already in here. So it'll provide a little bit more texture in the meatball. So we're gonna go ahead and small dice some white onion. You don't wanna have this too big. You want the onion to be part of the meatball rather than, you don't want anything to stand out and to be too strong and overbearing. So contrary to the tomato sauce, when we were chopping the onions for the tomato sauce, the irregularity of the size of the onions didn't matter as much because that got pureed in here. In this case, we want the onions to be all the same size. So as it cooks, everything cooks evenly. So the chopped raw onion will go into the mixing bowl. One of the biggest hurdles to people when cooking at home is there's such a mountain of cleanup at the end. So by staying ahead of things, by prepping and keeping yourself organized, will only help you at the end when it comes to cleaning up. And oftentimes that'll make cooking a lot more fun for people. Coupled with the idea of not necessarily knowing how flavors come together and how to physically make something, as well as making a mess in the kitchen, oftentimes people are apprehensive to cook or to try things because of that. I'm here to tell you to please try it. Life's too short, and the more you do it, the more proficient you'll get, and it will naturally become much easier for you. The thing we haven't added to this that we need to kind of bring it together is some kosher salt. Okay, kosher salt's very important, or any salt in that matter. If you don't have kosher, kosher is nice because it's coarse. You can feel it. You have an idea of how much you're putting in, contrary to, say, table salt or iodized salt, as it were, which is much finer. It has its purposes, it has its uses, but as chefs, we tend to go by feel. All right, we can feel the kosher salt much better than we can the iodized salt. How do we know when the sauce is done? Well, it's a consistency thing. We're looking for a particular consistency of the sauce. There's no right or wrong here. Some like it more thick, some like it thinner. Wherever you like it is where you can turn it off. What's most important is by the time you turn it off that you're tasting it, you're seasoning it, but we'll come back to this. Everything's in the bowl here, so now, clean hands, we're gonna go through and mix this. What we're not gonna do here is we're not gonna squeeze it through our hands. What we wanna do is we simply wanna mix it. We want to bring the ingredients together by folding it on top of each other without compressing it to mix it. The eggs are in different parts, the cheeses are in different parts, so as we mix this, it'll all come together appropriately. So from the bottom, turn it onto itself. Turn. Turn. I'm pushing down with my fingers without squeezing. Folding, turning. This is arguably one of the most important steps. Apart from seasoning the meatballs, this is going to be one of your more important steps. And again, the idea of using your hands here is because you can really feel what's going on in the bowl. A spoon will not give you that. It simply can't. So as you can see, it's still relatively not together at this point. We're getting there, but we're not squeezing at this point. So now all the herbs are starting to dispense through there and disperse. I can feel the texture of the onions, the raw onion that are in there, the celery and the garlic that are in there. You won't feel quite as much because they're going to be a little bit softer. I'm also not worried about if this is 100% mixed. We want to be in the probably 85 to 90% mix range, but you know, there may be a little pocket of a piece of pork or a piece of beef that's not fully incorporated with everything. That's quite okay. Everything's fully incorporated. And now we're gonna go back and wash our hands with soap and water. Now what we wanna do is we wanna portion them. There's a few ways of doing this. Ice cream scoop works well. You can simply go in, dig in, take a level scoop, drop them down, and then form them. A simple tablespoon will work in the event you don't have an ice cream scoop. There's no need to go out and get anything. All we're looking to do is get uniform portions at this point. Meatball portions vary. Some people like them incredibly large. Some people like them on the smaller side. That's completely up to you. I find somewhere right in the middle. Somewhere 3 to 4 ounces tends to work best for me. As they cook, they will shrink down. So just because you put a size on your pan does not mean by the time it's cooked, it's gonna end up on that size. So if you want something, make your meatballs marginally bigger when you put them on here than you want your final meatballs to be. I'm using a non-stick baking sheet here. In the event you don't have a non-stick baking sheet, you would want to line this with either parchment paper, tin foil would work, even wax paper. Because this is non-stick, I don't need to add any additional oil to this pan. You could. In the event you're using foil or parchment paper or wax paper, you would want to put that on top of your pan and you would want to lightly grease that with olive oil. Portioning the meatballs, again with a tablespoon. Take the size meatball you want and drop your portions right on your baking sheet. I'm not worried about forming these at this point. I simply want to make the portion. Once all the portions are down, then we can go back. Then I'll go back and I'll roll the meatballs. And now I'm going to go through and hand roll them. Hand rolling to me, we don't want to squeeze them at this point. We don't want to throw them back and forth in our hands. We simply just want to create a shape here. I'm simply putting them in the palm of both hands and rolling my hands together to create a shape. We're not pressing, we're not squeezing, we're simply creating a shape here. So as we continue to roll the meatballs, one thing that you can do to help yourself is you can get yourself a bowl and put a little bit of water in there. You can just wet your hands a little bit and that will prevent the meatballs from, the meatballs are going to want to stick to your hands the more and more you roll them. By having a little bit of water, rubbing it between your hands will allow you to roll the meatballs in a tighter formation without compressing them. So the water may help. You don't need it, but if in the event you would like it, it may help. So as I continue to make more meatballs, we want to get the oven temperature preheating. The meatballs are going to take anywhere from 10 to 12 minutes, depending upon your oven. I have my oven set at 425 with on convection, meaning there's a fan. In the event you don't have convection, I would suggest you raise your temperature to 450 and maybe increase by a minute or so. So the meatballs are out of the oven. As you can see on a few of these, because I didn't over compress them while rolling them, there's a few cracks in them and so on and so forth. Perfectly fine. What that does is it allows those points to get a little bit brown, which imparts flavor. The tomato sauce has finished simmering on the stove. The sausage has been removed. At this point, the sausage is fully cooked. And it can be used in a few different ways, but for this purpose of the sauce, we're done with this for now, and that can be added for future dishes somewhere. The sauce, well, I want to try it one more time. We've seasoned in layers with the salt. Now what we want to do, taste it and make any necessary adjustments. It's right there. A touch of salt really rounds the flavor out, as well as a few whole basil leaves. If they're a little large and you don't want the basil quite so big, just tear it into 2 or 3 pieces. We're now off the heat on the tomato sauce, and we're simply just stirring that basil in and that salt at the very end, just to impart that basil flavor into the sauce. No more heat needed. We're just keeping that at a very, very low, warm temperature. Then we get into the soft polenta. This is a soft pecorino polenta. What that means is pecorino cheese. It's a sheep's milk cheese. It's a hard cheese, similar to, say, a Parmesan, except Parmesan's made from cow's milk. Pecorino's made from a sheep's milk. It tends to be a little bit sharper in flavor. Parmesan would work perfectly fine if you couldn't find this or don't have this. But I personally like the sharpness of the pecorino in this polenta. This is considered a soft polenta. What polenta is essentially cornmeal. Cornmeal and water or chicken stock. It's a porridge, so to speak. What we're gonna do is we have some chicken stock on the stove at a boil. Generally, when we think of polenta, it's a 4-to-1 ratio. What that means is 4 parts liquid to 1 part polenta. A couple key tools that you're gonna need for this. You wanna start with a whisk. What the whisk does is the tines from the whisk really work through the chicken stock and the polenta to really smooth out any lumps that you may have. Once the polenta is in the pot and it's whisked in and incorporated, we're going to remove this tool and switch to a rubber spatula. You could use a wooden spoon in this case. Rubber spatula tends to work well. What we want to do is we want to get into those corners of the pans and really move that polenta around. And we're going to whisk in the polenta as we stream it in. We don't have to worry about going too slow here or too fast. It really won't make a huge difference at the very end. But this is a 4-to-1 ratio right here. What we want to do at this point is turn your heat down to low. This is going to boil pretty quickly. Once you add the polenta to it, it tends to get it gets so thick, and if it boils away, it can hurt you if it burns you. This polenta that we're using is a medium grind polenta. It's imported from Italy. It doesn't have to be. You could use a finer polenta. It would yield a finer texture at the very end. I like the idea of the medium grind on the polenta. It gives us a little bit of texture that I personally like. This is technically cooked at this point, so you could eat this, serve it. We're going to salt it and season it and taste it. But in terms of it being cooked, this is completely edible at this point. We are going to take it a step further by adding a few more ingredients to it, as well as I like to keep it on the stove for about 10-15 minutes. So this is one where you want to constantly keep it moving. At this point, now that the polenta has come together, we can switch tools. This tool, the whisk at this point has served its purpose, and it's just no longer necessary. In this case, we want to get in here now with the spatula. And what I was sharing earlier was we want to get into the corners of this pan. In the event we don't, what will happen is things will start to stick, start to scorch. So at this point, before we add anything else, I just want to keep this moving, making sure that there's nothing sticking. I'm constantly moving the spatula along the sides of the pan. What that does is it'll grab anything that might be stuck to the side of the pan that we want to keep incorporating in. In the event we missed that step and it kind of cooked in, you wouldn't want to fold that in at that point. You would want to maybe remove it with the spatula and get rid of it. I would discard it. It may not incorporate back into the polenta, and you may get a series of different textures in there that you're not otherwise looking for. Certainly nothing critical, just a fine detail that to me matters. The details in food matter. So at this point, the polenta's been cooking for, about 5 minutes or so. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add some heavy cream. I don't know that I'm gonna use all of this. It's a texture thing. We definitely wanna soften this down a little bit. And the cream certainly does that for us, as well as the butter and the cheese at the end to really richen this up. Keep in mind the tomato sauce itself has a light quality to it. It's not a heavy sauce, it's not over reduced. The meatball, again, apart from some cheese and some meat, there's some fat in there, but there's also a lot of flavor in there. So we're gonna take and add a little bit of cream to this. I'm not worried about the temperature here. The cream's not ice cold. It's been out for a little while. I may not want to add directly to this pan ice cold cream out of the fridge. I may just want to leave it out for just a little while. Sometimes the temperature, we don't want to shock anything or anything along those lines. And at this point would be a good time to introduce some salt. We're not worried about layering flavors in so much at this point, contrary to the tomato sauce that cooks for a long time where we want to layer some flavors in. So we're just folding that in. Gonna add a little bit more cream, and I know we'll be good on that. And then we'll taste it shortly, make sure our seasoning's good, and we'll finish this with some butter. Again, butter does not need to be added to this. It adds another level of richness to this that I like. This is considered a soft polenta, meaning that when we put polenta on a plate or on a bowl, it'll flatten out, it'll soften. Contrary to where you others see polenta, where it's known as a firm polenta, where we could take the same polenta before the addition of cream, refrigerate it, slice it, and either grill it or pan saute it, and that provides a completely different texture to the same ingredient. So now we're moving the polenta around. Our 4-to-1 ratio worked perfectly in this, as it will. The cream's there to simply an undertone for richness here. And the trick here is just to keep it moving. In the event we still had the whisk in here rather than the spatula, it tends to get a little gloppy. It tends to stick into the tines of the whisk. So right tool, right job. The problem is you may not always know the right tool. So the idea is to come on this journey and learn more about technique, tools, proper methods, so on and so forth. This would be a good time to try it and see where things stand. So what we need to consider at this point is we're looking for flavor. Everything on its own needs to be great. Meaning the meatballs have to be well seasoned, the polenta has to be well seasoned, and the tomato sauce needs to be well seasoned. The idea being that when we bring the dish together, everything can stand on its own and be great, and it works well as a complete dish, which we'll see shortly. This polenta, at this point, still is a little too thick for what we want, but that's done on purpose. We still have the butter that'll soften that out. The cheese will not add anything texturally. If anything, it may dry it out a little bit more, in which case you could come back and add a little bit more chicken stock. If you're out of chicken stock, for example, you could simply put a few tablespoons of water in there to achieve your purpose, or even some more cream if you needed. It does need a little bit more salt from when I tasted it, except I'm not going to over salt at this point. I don't want one thing out of the 3 components to this dish, the sauce, the meatballs, or the polenta. We don't want one thing to stand out too far. We want this all to work together. So to finish this up, we're going to go ahead and add our pecorino and our butter. We'll incorporate this. We'll do a final test, and then we'll plate. That butter is just incorporating in. It's a smooth mixture. Now that our cheese and our butter are in there, we'll do a final taste, make any necessary adjustment, and we'll bring the whole dish together. Very good. Touch more salt, and I'm going to add just a few more drops of cream. and we will be finished on this. Incorporate that in. So as we finish incorporating the polenta, everything's staying warm. The meatballs are warm, fresh out of the oven. The polenta is on low. The tomato sauce is on low. And when we come back, we'll plate the dish and we'll bring it all together. So it's time to bring this whole dish together. The polenta's finished cooking, well seasoned. Everything's incorporated. Tomato sauce is warm. Meatballs are out of the oven. So now it's time to plate. So now we take a little bit of the polenta right in the center. You can get as fancy with this as you'd like. It's a very, very rustic dish, so fancy is not particularly what we're looking for here, but a couple of meatballs right in the center. And then our tomato sauce. We don't want to fully cover the meatballs in this case. We still want to see that they're roasted. So what I like to do is just kind of run the sauce through the middle, so you get to see all the different colors. A little bit of fresh pecorino at the very end, just to reinforce everything that's in there, as well as a basil garnish. And here's our final dish. Thank you so much for joining in this episode of Christopher's Cucina. I look forward to seeing everybody on the next episode where we explore everything chicken.